Hello world, welcome to another C++ tutorial. Today we're going to go over while loops and for loops. You can think of these loops as another way to take control of the flow of your program. So let's start with while loops. So when I have a while loop, I think about it like this. While something is still true, do this. So basically we're going to have a condition similar to an if statement, but instead of evaluating it once and moving on, we keep evaluating the condition after our block of code that we want to run. And after that condition becomes false, we exit the while loop and move on. Alright guys, so to start I'm going to type in the keyword while, followed by parentheses, and in these parentheses this is where our condition is going to go. So a typical condition that we use loops for are when we want to use an iterator. One example would be to iterate through a count, increment or decrement something. So I'm just going to make an iterator. We can make an int, an integer called Iterator, and I want to run my loop 5 times. So I'm just going to initialize this iterator to 0. Usually we always have our iterators start at 0. And my condition I'm going to ask is my iterator less than 5, because we're starting at 0. So each iteration of the loop is going to be 0. The next iteration is going to be 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 5, and then once iterator becomes 5, it's no longer less than 5, because 5 is not less than 5. So that makes the condition false and breaks execution of the loop and continues the normal flow of the program. So for the execution inside my loop, what I want to do is just increment an integer variable called count. I can make that outside here. Int count, and I'm just going to initialize this to 0 as well. Okay, so each time this loop runs, I want to add 1 to the count. So we can do this like this. There's multiple ways you can do this. You can do count equals count plus 1. And then you could also do something like, oh, get an error here. Close the parentheses. You can also do something like count plus equals 1. So what that's going to do, it's basically saying count equals count plus 1. Another common thing to do is just this, count plus plus. So this plus plus operator increments something by 1. So it's just going to add 1 to the overall count. For reference, you could also do like a minus minus that subtracts 1 instead of adding. But here we just want to add 1. And we can also do a cout here so you can see on the console. Oops, there's not a string. So we can see each iteration of the loop. So you should see 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 be displayed to the console in this case. Another thing to note is that we also want to add the iterator, because remember the while loop always runs if the iterator is less than 5. So if we don't add to our iterator at all, we're going to get stuck in what's called an infinite loop, and then we'd be all lost in our program execution and freak out trying to fix the issue, when really we're just stuck in a loop we don't want. We don't want that. So I'm just going to do this at the end here, iterator plus plus. So this loop is just going to keep running until this statement becomes false. Okay. So I'm going to run it here. There you go. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's 5 iterations of the loop. Okay. Now on the 5th iteration, the iterator is 5, but it's not less than 5. So this condition is false, so it exits. You can see here that it never reaches the 5th iteration, or past the 5th iteration, because again we're starting from 0, so that makes it run 5 times. So let me close this. Now just to make it clear again we're asking the condition, is the iterator less than 5? So if that statement's true, then it's going to run the loop, execute this block of code right here, which increments the count and increments the iterator, so that eventually when we ask the condition again, is the iterator less than 5, eventually it's going to be greater than 5, or just 5, depending on how you have this set up. For here it's just going to reach 5, and it breaks at when 5 is less than 5, that's false. We can finally stop running the loop and continue with the normal flow of our program. So that's how while loops work. Now moving on to for loops. Alright guys, so for for loops, it's the same principle as while loops. So we're going to run a loop as many times as we want until a certain condition is proven to be false. But the major difference is a while loop will consist of 3 statements. So the first statement is executed one time before the execution of the code block. The second statement defines the condition for executing the code block, similar to the condition in the while loop. And the third statement is executed every time after the code block has been executed. So it's similar to like this iterator ++ down here, or any of the code really down here. So for statement 1, it gets executed once and only once before the first iteration of the loop. So common usage is to declare or initialize our iterator. So again, I'm going to make an int variable here, int I, and set it to 0. And if we do this in a for loop, we use the keyword for, and then in parentheses. And for that iterator I just mentioned, I'm going to make it right here, int I, and we can also initialize it to 0. Separate it with a semicolon, and this is the first statement of the for loop. Now the second statement follows this semicolon. This is where our condition goes. So I'm going to make I'm going to make use of the same condition we have in the loop above, in our while loop where it says iterator is less than 5. Our iterator here instead is this int I that we just made. So instead we can just use I is less than 5. And then for the last statement, it gets executed at the end of the loop each time. And you can think about that as this iterator ++ here from the above while loop. So usually that's what a for loop will look like. You'll have this iterator being initialized, your condition, and then the increment of the iterator. Then I can have my little coding block here. And again, we can do a little cout to show you that we're in this for loop and how it works. I'll just do for loop count. And instead here, I'll actually use a different count variable, count2. That way our program doesn't use this old one, because that's already going to be manipulated, and I want to start from scratch. So then I can just do this count2 ++. And you'll notice that in the while loop we did that iterator ++. I'm not going to do that here because, again, remember, we made our iterator in the for loop syntax up here. So we're incrementing this I right here, this I++. That's the same thing as doing this. It's just not inside the body of the for loop. So then we can execute this code, and you will see... Oh, sorry, you're not actually seeing the count. Let me add this count2 variable here. It should be the same as that while loop. There you go. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 from the while loop right here. In the for loop, it says for loop count 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Same thing. So it achieves the same thing, but the syntax is different. And you're probably asking, when would you want to use a while loop or a for loop if they're achieving the same thing, right? So if you want to do something until a certain condition is met, just use the while loop. It's much more simpler. If you want to iterate through an object, like a count or very commonly an array, use the for loop, because this is usually what people do here. Initialize an iterator, have your condition to iterate through, and then you increment the iterator. So that's very useful for going through objects, again, like an array. Another thing to think about is being careful not to get caught in infinite loops. Where your condition is never proven false, then that makes it so your program sits in an infinite loop, and then you get stuck and you can't continue with your program. So you want to make sure that you're meeting certain criteria in order to not only correctly manipulate your data, but to also correctly exit your loop and continue with the normal flow of the program. So I think that's everything I wanted to go over for while loops and for loops. You should be able to use this stuff pretty successfully now. I guess that's it, and I will catch y'all later in another tutorial. Deuces and peace.